fact, you're finding now in more and more cities where they're putting meters in, people are paying a unit price for their water. It's through these mechanisms that, as you mentioned with regard to the communications, they put in these general categories that then can become a catch-all for whatever they want to actually do.
Right. So even if they're harmful, the public has no standing to deal with it at all.
That's right.
No standing.
Legally, because the agreement has been signed. And, of course, you see, one of the things with an agreement is that, and this is the issue with regard to the NAFTA, when you say, well, we already had 80% free trade, then the question becomes, well, what was there left to negotiate about? I've learned this by being involved in negotiations myself over contracts between faculty and the university. And we were setting up our first contract, and I got very good advice from a couple of people. They said, get everything you possibly can into that first contract, because once you sign it, in order to change it, you're going to have to give up something. You're left with very little to bargain with after that. And so, of course, this is the issue. What was left to set the NAFTA in place if you already had 80% free trade? And so the answer is, of course, it was the water. That's how the two people at the table were both experts in North American water, and that's why I argue that that's really what it was all about.
Okay, I want to go back to this question I had, which is how and why was Canada separated from the USA in the first place?
Geography is the stage, and history is the play that's played out on that stage. You can study them separately, but you really don't understand the importance of them, and you certainly don't understand the importance of geography to history. For example, during the Israeli conflict with Egypt back in the 60s, it was interesting that all the reports were coming in about what were critical areas and who was controlling them, and they were talking about the Gida and Mitla passes, and that Israel had seized control of those. And I'm thinking, I've heard those names before. Well, the answer is, of course, that they were considered critical control points in the Bible. And so the geography doesn't change. You can change the pattern of how people move around the geography. For example, when we talk about trade, when you look at the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, and how those totally changed the pattern of movement because you changed the geography. If you look at North America, the orientation of it geographically is north-south. That you've got the eastern seaboard, and it's reflected, by the way, in the distribution of the Aboriginal peoples. So you've got the Indians in the northeastern U.S., and then the Mi'kmaq on the east coast of Canada stretching along that coast. Then you've got inland, the Mohawk on the Canadian side, the Iroquois on the American side. The border cuts right through the middle of them. And then in the Plains Indians, and then you've got the Rocky Mountain Indians, and then you've got the West Coast. So the whole orientation of the continent is north-south. And yet suddenly you've got this boundary cutting right across the middle of the continent, essentially along the 49th parallel. And it just cuts across. Now the most effective barriers, or boundaries I should say, coincide with a natural physical barrier. And in fact, if you look at Europe, there are only 4 boundaries that are over 100 years old. And each of them is determined by a physical boundary. One of the most obvious ones, the Pyrenees between France and Spain. Switzerland, its boundaries existed for 100 years for obvious geographic reasons. Now, obviously, with the Great Lakes, where you put the boundary down the middle, you can say, well, the lake represents a physical barrier. And to some extent it does. Along the St. Lawrence is some logic to that, but then when you get into New England, it becomes very confused. But across the rest of the continent is this 49th parallel. Well, the reason for that boundary being there was partly, of course, that the northern part of the continent was occupied by the British, and they were determined to maintain it and did it reasonably successfully, but also, of course, a lot of people who were living in the United States that didn't want to become part of the U.S., they wanted to remain monarchists, moved to Canada. And we have a very large group of people in eastern Canada called the United Empire Loyalists. And these are the people that wanted to remain with monarchy. That was a political reason, but more important for most of the continent, that boundary marks the southern edge of huge drainage basins. Now, each river system has a drainage basin, and around the edge of that drainage basin is a watershed. A watershed is a height of land that separates water draining into one drainage basin from another drainage basin. But you also have what are called divides. And a divide is a watershed, but it's on a continental scale. It's a watershed that separates water flowing from one ocean into another ocean. So the continental divide down the Rocky Mountains separates water flowing into the Pacific Ocean from water flowing into the Mississippi or the Gulf of Mexico. Well, one of the major divides, ironically, is across the flattest part of the continent, right across the middle, that separates water from the Mississippi-Missouri system flowing south from the waters through the Churchill and Nelson and all those river systems draining into the Arctic Ocean. That boundary between those two major divides was the boundary that was the land given to the Hudson Bay Company. So Charles II said the Hudson Bay Company can have all the land that is drained by water flowing into the Arctic Ocean. Now, of course, when Canada was formed in 1870 and the U.S. were being formed, that boundary then became essentially the dividing line between the two countries. There was all sorts of interesting stories that came out of that. One story you'd love is about the weather conditions in central North America, the boundary between Saskatchewan and North Dakota. And there was a Norwegian family that settled there, and the Canadian survey crew came through in the 1870s to draw the boundary, the 49th parallel. They went to this Norwegian family and said, you're a mile south of the line, but if you want to move into Canada and become Canadians, you can do that. And they said, no, we're quite happy where we are. And that was fine. They drew the boundary. Well, it turned out they got the boundary out wrong. And so they came back 4 years later and moved the boundary south. And they went and knocked on the Norwegian settlers' family's door and said, well, we've had to move the boundary. You're now Canadians, but if you want to move south into the U.S., you could do that. The Norwegian family said, oh, this is terrible. Canadian surveyors were upset because they didn't want anybody not to want to live in Canada. And they said, well, what's the problem? And the Norwegian family said, how are we ever going to stand those horrible Canadian winters?
Oh, my God.
Yeah, local regional humor about boundaries. But anyway, that's why the continent was divided on the basis of water. Now, of course, if you think about what I said earlier...
Does that mean I should move to Canada?
Absolutely, yes.
Tell me why. Tell me why. Tell us why we should move to Canada.
First of all, we've got the second largest country in the world with a population equal to California. If you were to list every country in the world and list what resources it would like to have, Canada's got them all. We are so resource rich, it is unbelievable. One of the things that always amuses me, we've got Saskatchewan, a province, which is twice the size of Texas in area, and it is listed, was until recently, listed in Canada as a have-not province. That is that it was getting support funding from other provinces, like Alberta, that is considered a have province, in order to maintain itself. And it calls itself a have-not province, and what amuses me about it is it's got more oil, more gas, more uranium, more water, more coal, more land than virtually any other country in the world. But it's listed as a have-not province in Canada. Now, of course, its difficulty is that it's got only 1 million people in an area twice the size of Texas and trying to maintain a 20th century infrastructure. I mean, you just imagine the taxes needed just for maintaining roads. Just to give you an example, when I was in search and rescue, we were flying in northern Canada, and the California family, the brother was flying in our aircraft, and he accused us by noon of just flying around in circles. And I said, well, how can you say that? And he said, well, I haven't seen a village or road, nothing. And I said, well, we've covered 10,000 square miles. And he said, well, how can that be? I haven't seen any sign of humans at all. I said, welcome to Canada.
That's interesting.
In fact, to convince him, we had to fly back to the Slave River and south along it, and then along the Peace River back to Fort Chipewyan to help him understand just the sheer size of this country. It is, of course, the resources and the Athabasca tar sands, which Americans have now become aware of, that is what's so advantageous to this country. Now, Canada's always been accused of being hewers of wood and haulers of water. And how prophetic is that with regard to the NAFTA agreement? And by the way,